O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
Welcome back, everyone. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I want to speak to you guys about the moral argument for the existence of God. And so today we're going to be diving into some Christian apologetics, in which I hope to introduce you guys to this argument, maybe its history, how does it work, what is the form it takes. And so I hope this is just the beginning in a whole host of videos I make over the next few months in regards to various Christian apologetical arguments, and continue in the same vein of a previous video I made you guys may have saw on how to prove God to an atheist, where we discussed the transcendental argument for God, which is my personal favorite in terms of apologetic approaches to argumentation for God's existence, in which you are trying to get your dialogue opponent to provide justification for the use of what's called philosophical transcendentals. And so if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, maybe go check that video out, which will also be at the end of this video. But that is in the school of what's called presuppositional apologetics. And so a lot of the other arguments I plan on introducing in the future, though I don't think they're as strong, they are part of what's called the evidentialist school of apologetics. And so today we're going to be getting into the moral argument, which I think is really a nice segue between the sort of presuppositional to the evidentialist approach of apologetic methods. And so that's what you can expect. And really, without any further ado, let's just get into the moral argument for the existence of God. All right, so let's get into the moral argument for the existence of God. And we see here on the first slide that I have, it says, can you be good without God? And so just for instrumental pedagogical purpose, I have here as our atheist who says, of course I can. Watch me do this generous act. And I did it without believing in God. I helped this small child. I did something generous for this elderly person. I got this cat out of a tree, But we have to clarify, that is not what we're asking. We're not asking, can you be good without believing in God? Of course you can. That is a very superficial understanding of what we're trying to do here. The real question is, can the good exist without the existence of God? This is the question at hand for us who are using the moral argument for the existence of God. It's as I will point out, this is a meta-ethical question. And so the argument is concerned with the objective standard of things being good or bad. How do we know that to be the case? And can an objective standard of morality exist without the existence of God? Of which we'll say absolutely not. And so what we will get into is determining that morality can only be one of two things. It can be absolute and objective, or it can be relative. And so part of our argument is going to show that when you begin to ground morality in anything outside of God, anything within creation, you're going to end up with a relativistic morality, which, as we're going to be arguing, is that nobody actually believes in. And so, does an objective absolute morality exist that spans cultures, times, and places? Is it really universal? And so the framework of the argument is working, as I said, at the meta-ethical level. And this is where I think it's really a good segue between the tag argument and moving into more evidentiary forms of argumentation in regards to Christian apologetics. Why? Well, if you remember from my previous video on the tag argument, we discussed the sort of two different approaches to philosophy between Plato and Aristotle, and how Aristotle represents what's called the classical foundationalist model, of which knowledge has a foundation. That foundation is induction, and we build upon that foundation step by step. Now, in this argument here, it's kind of like I said, a good segue, because that was that Aristotelian approach to philosophy, that Aristotelian approach to knowledge, was what we were rejecting in our tag argument for a presuppositional approach, an a priori deductive approach. And so I think, like I said, this is a good segue into the Aristotelian, the classical foundationalist arguments, which we're going to find in evidentialist apologetics. And so this, like I said, is working at the meta-ethical level. This is very different from the other forms of ethics, what's called normative ethics, which is asking questions like, what should I do? And applied ethics, which is more about the practical application of ethics, which you'll see in the medical field, law, politics, and stuff like that. So we are asking questions such as, what is goodness? How can we tell what is good from what is bad? And you see, this is very different, just to highlight how this is a very different order of question than what you would see in normative ethics, like I have here, what should I do? Well, what should I do is already assuming a good, already assuming a sort of moral landscape, and then asking what you should do in this particular situation. We are asking a higher order of question. What is good itself? What is morality? How do we understand what is good from what is bad? And so we are going to be arguing that God's nature provides an objective reference point for all moral values, that without God's existence, there is no objective morality, and that is really the basis of this argument. Without the existence of God, there is no objective reference point, and all attempts at grounding morality are going to be led to relativism, as I already said. And so some of the places where people begin to try to ground morality, we'll see culture, we'll see humanity in general as a whole, we'll see individualism, and we'll see biology. And I have a slide here in which we'll discuss all those four variations of grounding morality and how they all come up short. And so utilitarianism and pragmatism are not going to be working at the meta-ethical level. This is very important because when we get into ethical discussions, a lot of times if people are going to be working off of maybe an atheistic framework, they're going to be using a sort of utilitarianism or a sort of pragmatism. And I just want to highlight how the utilitarianism and the pragmatism are going to fall within the sort of normative ethics and the applied ethics, right? Because the utilitarianism is assuming the greatest good for the greatest number. But at that order of question, you cannot get at what is good itself. Utilitarianism is already assuming what is good and then trying to figure out how you apply that to the most number of people. So that's sort of a normative ethical approach. And then the pragmatism, you could see that being tied to a sort of applied ethical approach, the practical application of ethics. And so utilitarianism or pragmatism itself are really going to not even approach the level of argumentation that we're dealing with here. And so the history of this argument, well, it's certainly not new. And just for time and space sake, I've only chose just a few examples here. I could have got into a lot more ancient philosophers and thinkers, but questions regarding the highest good have been central throughout ancient philosophy, including Plato's Republic, of which he said that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all and is seen to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right. So it is the author, the authority, the good, right? And this is Plato's kind of generic, ambiguous understanding of the good. And then we have, and that's from the Republic, and then we have Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he is talking about the good and kind of beginning to verge away from sort of Plato's understandings, or even the summum bonum of Cicero. And that's just a Latin phrase for the highest good, summum bonum. And so you could Google that and see that term is a very popular term, Latin term, that just refers to the highest good. And then that concept was dealt with throughout theology and philosophy moving forward. But St. Augustine, rooting this back into our Christian tradition, St. Augustine of Hippo identified the summum bonum as the highest human goal, that the highest good is the highest human goal, and it was a central feature of the Christian God on the nature of good. And so this is what we are doing. You see, moving from Plato's sort of generic, ambiguous, the good, we are saying that the good is actually a central feature and rooted within God. And so Augustine then denies the existence of evil in and of itself. And this is true within Christianity, usually, generally, although there are other forms, sort of Gnostic understandings, Manichaean understandings, where you're going to have this immense dualism where God, the good, is in this eternal battle with evil itself. And maybe God, the good, is just a little bit better, but there's actually a real struggle there. There's a real fight. And so that would be Manichaeanism, that would be Gnosticism, and that would be any of the sort of very dualistic theological or religious worldviews. Christianity does not support that view. Christianity, as Augustine points out, rather, evil is the absence or the distance from the good, which can only be found in God. So, if you want to think of it as God being in a concentric circles and it's the center dot, God, the good, is that central dot, and then the concentric circles moving out could be understood as variations of evil or the bad, right? That's getting worse and worse and worse in its absence of the good of God. And so a point that we really need to highlight here, because this gets confused, this was debated throughout ancient philosophy and even within Christianity, is we're not saying that it's good because God wills it. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying that God wills it because it's good. No, we are rather saying God is good, and anything he wills is of the good, meaning there is no differentiation between the good and God. Okay, these are one in of the same thing, and this is what we're arguing in our moral argument for the existence of God, taking and building upon maybe what St. Augustine was trying to do. And so this idea, though, was even discussed by Immanuel Kant when he argued in the Critique of Pure Reason that morality and moral thought requires the presupposition of God's existence, which again, we agree, this is sort of the basis for our argument. And this is why I said, again, it was a nice segue between the transcendental argument, which we're dealing with presuppositions and philosophical justification for transcendentals, that we are moving from there over to a more classical foundationalist Aristotelian model of induction and evidential factual statements, that this moral argument is kind of right in between, right? Because we're saying that you really can't have a morality, you can't even attempt moral thought with really a presupposition of God's existence, because that's the only way you're going to be able to root an objective, absolute, universal standard of morality. And so C.S. Lewis even appeals to the universal morality both in his apologetics and his fiction. And so C.S. Lewis, I'm sure many of you guys are already aware, but he was an Anglican, and he discussed in his Chronicles of Narnia that it was the deep magic which everyone knew, and that what that deep magic was morality. And so what C.S. Lewis called, I think it was natural law, natural morality, something of that sort. And so he even put these ideas, these Christian apologetic ideas, even in his fictional writing. And so the syllogism that we're going to be arguing here or trying to prove is, I put it down a couple different ways. The first one is that every law has a lawgiver. There is an absolute moral law, therefore there is an absolute moral lawgiver. So the burden of proof then is for us to say that every law has a lawgiver. We can demonstrate evidence for that, at least within the human sort of societal, civilizational standpoint. And we'll be highlighting natural objections to this in the next slide. And that there is an absolute moral law, and therefore there must be an absolute moral lawgiver. Or to put this another way, either morality is absolute or relative, because this is really the argument. And then we say morality is not relative by showing that nobody really upholds relative forms of morality. Nobody tries to hold other people to relative forms of morality. When people even make claims or moral claims, it's usually at a universal basis. And so we're saying morality is not relative. Therefore, morality is absolute. If morality is objective and absolute, God must exist. Why? Because that's the only way in which you can root it to be objective and universal and absolute. Morality is objective and absolute, therefore God exists. This is sort of the framework in which we're working with. And now, every law has a lawgiver. Okay, it seems pretty self-evident, at least within the context of human civilization and the principle of causality, or the principle of sufficient reason, really, that everything has to have a cause. And so the principle of sufficient reason not really developed, it goes back to the ancient Greek philosophical days, but often credited with really maybe building upon it, explicating it more, was Leibniz. And it really has to do that nothing comes from nothing. Something cannot come from nothing. That would violate the principle of sufficient reason. Really, it'd violate the principle of causality as well. And so the naturalist objection would say, well, the laws of nature occur through cosmological and evolutionary processes. No lawgiver needed, entirely of natural phenomenon, right? Because of their atheistic framework. However, all you have to do before we even get to the next point is you can start pushing them to justify those things. Eventually, it's going to be rooted in a Big Bang cosmology, which the Big Bang cosmology, even though scientists, secularists, naturalists don't want to move into the theological implications of the beginning of the universe having a beginning point, this is what the Kalam cosmological argument is really dealing with in terms of talking about ideas of infinity, the infinite nature of the universe, but the universe also having a beginning point. And so if you get them to regress back to, well, this all comes from the Big Bang, their theory of the Big Bang, again, violates the principle of sufficient reason, violates the principle of causality, because they believe something came from nothing ultimately. And then they might push it back. We'll say, no. Well, you see, we have the multiverse. And that question, don't let that fool you. They're just pushing it back again because you still have to account for the somethingness of the multiverse eventually coming from nothing. But another way to go about it is you could first describe, well, what do you mean by laws of nature? That already is a very ambiguous and contentious term. We'd have to, really get some concrete details as to what are the laws of nature that you're talking about. And second, your cosmological theory assumes everything is changing, right? Evolutionary processes, the universe is in continual flux. Yet you believe these laws to be unchanging, generally speaking. Now, it would not account for all scientists. This would not account for all naturalists. In fact, we have theorists like Rupert Sheldrake, who argues for more of a habitual pattern of nature. So he would be against the idea of laws, for more of the universe has habits. But that's a whole nother wormhole to go down, and it'd be different arguments that you would be dealing with there. But thirdly, something coming from nothing, as I said, is a violation of the principle of causality and the principle of sufficient reason. So you're going to have to deal with that whole thing, which is why you see the new movement with quantum physics, with quantum mechanics, is all these secularists, all these atheists who are really adamant at trying to disprove a theological understanding of the universe or theology itself or the existence of God, are now trying to argue for an eternal universe. An eternal universe. Why? Because just like Aristotle, just like Plato, just like the ancients, if you had an eternal universe, well, then now we can have something without it coming from nothing, which is the big kind of theist critique to the Big Bang argument, right? It has even actually led many naturalists and scientists to a sort of theistic worldview because of the implications of the Big Bang. And so moving on, there is an absolute moral law. Absolute, objective, perpetual, and universal. This is what we mean by absolute. And moral is something good in itself. We're talking about ought claims here. We're talking about is versus oughts, and we are dealing with ought claims. And so we're saying there is an absolute moral law, and morality is not relative. It's not relative. And we're going to be highlighting the various sources for grounding morality and why, if those all lead to a relative morality, those can't be true. And so the first one, of course, is culture, which is very easy to see why that would lead to a relativistic morality. Culture is entirely different, or morality is entirely different across cultures. Therefore, one cannot critique or judge a culture from another without using your relative standard against their relative standard. So if culture is the grounding for morality, which this is actually a common sort of sociological argument for morality. So this is not something that just dumb people. This is something you'd find in the academy. This is something you'd find academics arguing, that morality is really, it's just cultural variations. Okay. Well, if that is true, then every cultural moral standard is relative, and therefore for me to critique female genital mutilation or whatever nasty things going on in a different society, whether that be pedophilia, incest, something of that sort, well, I can't even critique it. Why? Because I don't have an objective standard to critique it from. So therefore, if number one is if culture is where we ground it, well, then we can never actually critique other cultures because every culture is relative, and this is where you would find the state of sociology right now. Now, what about humanity? What if we rooted morality in humanity making their own moral claims? And so this one is actually a two-part one. The first little thought experiment I want to do is let's pretend that there's only one culture. Let's just pretend. Of course, this would never be the case, but there's people who identify as globalists, and they want to create a one world order. And by doing so, they would love to create one culture and one moral standard. And if they did that, then they could arbitrarily declare something to be moral. Whether that be, let's just theoretically say that there were very influential and powerful people who were, in fact, pedophiles. Let's just pretend, of course, this would never be the case, but let's pretend that there are people who would want to promote things such as incest, such as, let's just pretend that to be the case. And then humanity, if humanity is the way in which we ground morality, well, then we can just declare that to be moral, and now it is. However, nobody actually thinks that to be the case. And then if you were to use another, so moving away from our thought experiment of a one world government, although I guess we could stay in that domain, utilitarianism is usually then the go-to method for talking about ethics on a humanitarian scale in regard to humanism, really. And that we just deal with the greatest good for the greatest number. But the problem, as we mentioned on the outset of this presentation, is utilitarianism actually isn't even dealing with the questions that we're presenting because it can't talk about goodness in itself. It is already assuming what is good, given the place in which utilitarian comes from, meaning Western Europe. We would already argue that it's already assuming the good based on a Christian worldview, and therefore utilitarianism can't be a place for grounding ethics because it can't account for meta-ethical questions. And so let's move on to the third one, individualism. Well, that one's just really easy because then everything's entirely subjective. We can't make any ought claims because if we were, that ought claim is only in regards to that individual person. So therefore, there are no universal ought claims that could be made. You can't say killing or rape or this or that is wrong because you just need one individual to say, well, actually, I agree with that. And now you're back into a relative moral understanding. So individualism easily can't be the case. Now, biology, the fourth one, is actually the one that most people in the academy, most scientists, most atheists, most naturalists will move to in opposition to an objective, absolute moral standard. Because the nature of this argument is if we prove that morality is actually absolute and objective, it clearly follows that then God exists. And so the argument is to try to disprove any absolute or objective state of morality. And so in biology, we have what's called evolutionary naturalism. And this is basically the go-to move to say that like I said, it's the most common objection to absolute morality. It literally believes nothing is right and wrong at all. It basically taking an approach, again, a naturalistic approach from the animal kingdom. When a cat eats a mouse, there is no ethical problem there. There is no such thing as murder, right? These are all human constructions is which really they're going to get into, because nothing is right or wrong. Morality is a byproduct of natural selection, which attached a sense of morality to the human psyche. Therefore, morality entirely exists in the human mind. It's just a conceptual thing. It's a mental phenomenon. And this is really what this is literally what they argue, that therefore there is no such thing as right or wrong, and that morality itself, that's nice, but that's just in your head. That's not actually in and of itself. And this was actually dealt with by C.S. Lewis. He would talk about universal morality. This is one of his apologetic approaches. In his writing, Mere Christianity, he references, but in other places as well. And he takes on the evolutionary naturalism and talks about how those who believe evolutionary naturalism still act as if objective moral truth exists, thereby demonstrating the incoherency and the lack of applicability of that method, of that approach, of that model, if you will. So those are going to be the sources. If morality isn't rooted in God, what could it be rooted in? Well, it could be rooted in culture. That can't be. That leads to relativity. Well, it could be rooted in humanity. Well, that leads to relativity. Well, it could be rooted in individuals. That leads to relativity. Or it can lead in biology, right? This is all a natural evolutionary phenomenon. Well, that leads to morality. That actually leads to no sense of morality at all. That argues, it goes even deeper, that this stuff is just clearly mental phenomenon that has no real existence outside of the mind. So moving forward, again, there is an absolute moral law. Moral absolutes are self-evident. So not that we would argue from Scripture, but this is right there in Romans 2:15, where morality is written on our heart. We know this to be true, and this is where the objective, absolute, universal appeal comes from this argument, is that we know, it doesn't matter what culture you're in, you know that murdering your grandmother, raping your daughter, this stuff is wrong. This stuff violates an objective sense that, again, is written on the heart. And so Thomas Aquinas, not that we're the biggest fans of him, but we will be seeing more Aquinas as we move into evidentiary apologetics, that in his Summa Theologica, he talks about morality as a natural inclination, which, again, is consistent with Scripture and our understanding that God wrote morality on everybody's heart. And this is also how, although contentious, and depending on how you approach, some people can be saved without necessarily being Christian. I know that is a whole nother wormhole, and I really don't want to open that up, but that can be the case depending on their relationship with reason and logic and morality, which is written on their heart. And so C.S. Lewis, again, in his Mere Christianity, talked about how people are always appealing to an absolute objective moral standard. And so whenever you hear somebody say, "Oh, well, that's my seat, I was there first," well, that implies a whole host of things. That implies an objective, absolute state of morality in which that's my seat, I was there first, insinuates a sort of human dignity, the self, some sort of autonomy, and that you doing unto others, right, it's a big deal. And that we'll see this in the next one. How would you like it if someone did that to you, right? Do unto others as you wish to be treated. And so how you could easily see an atheist, you could easily see somebody who's trying to disprove the existence of God, yet still make these claims. Again, appealing to an absolute, objective, moral, universal standard. Give me yours. I gave you some of mine. Well, who cares? If morality isn't objective, why do you care what somebody else is doing? Leave him alone. He isn't hurting you. Well, who cares? If there is no such thing as morality, what's wrong with hurting somebody? What's wrong? Even if he isn't hurting me, what's wrong with me hurting him? You get into these arguments, and it's going to be difficult for people to explain. Come on, you promised, right? That somehow upholding your word, honor, honesty, integrity, these things are important. And again, these things are essentially going to be rooted in an absolute, objective moral law. And so from these examples that C.S. Lewis highlights, all these people are appealing to a standard they expect to be upheld by other people. So this is the kind of the fragmentation of people's psyches in the current society we find ourselves, that they can be assuming that all these other people need to do all these things, right? We see this in the inclusion and diversity and in the sort of leftist progressive movement that are based on an epistemological relativism, yet they make all these universal moral claims without having any framework to actually root these things. And that's kind of the incoherency and the internal contradiction is that's how you know it's the goal of the evil one, really, because logic, we worship the Logos, who incarnated as Jesus Christ. That is the source of logic. And so whenever we see anti-reason, anti-rationalism, people that are deliberately trying to be incoherent, these are an affront to the way in which we understand God gave us abilities to understand the world. And so now, moving to the next slide, there is an absolute moral law. When individuals break the moral standard, they often have excuses for why, but rarely, if ever, do they reject the standard as a whole. Take murder, for example. Take theft, for example. Just pick your crime, pick your indiscretion that transgresses, moral standards. And very few of those people who actually do that are going to reject an absolute morality in and of itself, but they're going to have an excuse for why they did it in this particular instance. So I guess one of the easier criticisms to what we're talking about on this slide is that, if you're going to take the biological approach or something, you say, oh, well, this is all evidence that this is just within the human psyche. You see, they just feel this way because they've been trained over society, because of their previous experience, because they're basically a Pavlov dog, right? And this is the training in which they've occurred, and then this is just the way in which they judge themselves. It doesn't mean that morality is still objective or it's absolute. So that you could see them appeal to that, but then as soon as they do, they're back into a relativistic morality, which we reject as a whole. And if they believe in a relativistic morality, they better not be saying any of the statements that we saw on the previous slide. They better not be making any universal statements. And if they truly believe that, they better start teaching their children those things as well, which I guarantee they're not. And so the fact excuses are made recognizes one's own accountability and responsibility to the moral standard. And there is no such thing as moral progress without an absolute moral law. What is progress judged upon? And this, I mentioned in previous videos about how all progress is only found in God. Because if we were talking about moral progress, let's talk about racism or slavery or anything like that. If culture is where we ground morality, if individualism, if humanity, if biology, well, there's no reason for why those things are better in and of themselves. Why is slavery bad if we don't have an objective moral standard to base that on? And I think we're actually seeing when you look at leftists, progressives, and their inability to really talk about like Libya and stuff like this, where open slave trades exist, yet they're infatuated with what happened in America in the 19th century. So it's you see this inconsistency. And moral progress to move forward is based on some type of standard, some type of rubric, some type of spectrum. And of course, that spectrum is going to have to be an absolute objective morality. And again, that has to be rooted in God. And that's why all progress, as I've mentioned in previous videos, can only be found in God. And without an absolute moral law, all moral judgments are opinion. And that's really what they are. Whether you take the biological approach, which they would agree, those natural scientists, you say, oh, well, there's no such thing as right and wrong. They would, yeah, it's all opinion. Culture, it's all opinion. Individuals, it's all opinion. Humanity, well, it's just the opinion of the elite, really. Or or some type of utilitarian understanding. Those are the two routes if we're going to ground morality in humanity. And so those who deny an absolute moral law contradict their own lives. This is highlighted by C.S. Lewis, and the values they teach their children. And so the undeniability of a moral law, it is innate and undeniable. And this is getting at it being written on the heart. This is about how everybody appeals to these objective universal standards. And so we know by our reaction when others break the standard and how we feel that there is something more to morality than just cultural conventions, than just relativistic constructions. It is the basis for human rights. All human rights are going to be rooted in a sense of morality, which is going to be rooted, and as Kant said, presupposes the existence of God. It is the unchanging standard for what constitutes justice. How do we understand justice? Justice, if we were to take the cultural grounding, the humanitarian grounding, the individual grounding, or the biological grounding of morality, why do we have courts? How can we ever get towards justice? Really, we wouldn't be able to. And so, again, parts of society, you see this internal contradiction that what I think Max Weber rightly calls spheres of rationalization, and that people just exist in all these different spheres and don't really think about the coherent, the consequences of God not existing or various assumptions that they make about the world. And so it defines the real difference between moral positions. If there is an absolute moral standard, well, then now I can critique female genital mutilation. Now I can critique incest, pedophilia, and rape. I can say all those things are undeniably wrong because they do not coincide with my absolute moral law, which is grounded in God. And so why do people make excuses if there is no absolute moral law? Well, you could see the biologist saying, well, that's just from their conditioning, but we'll just move on from there. So the possibilities. Okay, so now we've agreed that morality can't be relativistic. It can't. Because then all these other aspects of our society begin to fall apart because there is no standard. There's no standard for societal progress. There's no standard for moral progress. There's no standard for justice. There's no standard for the comparison between cultures and worldviews and various systems of morality. And so we could get to the point where, okay, we agree that there has to be an absolute moral law, and then given on our first syllogism, if there is a law, there is an absolute lawgiver. Well, then who could account for these things? And so you could think of Platonism and karma. But the problem with these ambiguous, kind of generic, generalistic understandings like Plato's the good or karma is that they're not personal. And then this brings in a very important question is, could morality exist prior to moral agents? This is really bringing up the question of personhood. Could morality exist before persons? And of course, from the Trinitarian understanding of God, God is three persons, and therefore it makes quite logical sense why morality could be given by that lawgiver, because there's already personhood there. There's already agency. And so that would be our big critique for Platonism and karma, is that they really can't be the moral lawgiver because they're not personal, and therefore they kind of undercut the idea that there has, how could morality exist prior to moral agents? Now, let's just say somebody says, well, they're brute observable facts. That's just easy. It's clear. We can observe that if people act morally, things are better. But that doesn't account for why or how or where. And so that is a violation of the principle of sufficient reason. Again, nothing comes from nothing. So something cannot come from nothing. And eventually, if they're going to say it's just an observable fact, then they're really, whether they're conscious of it or not, they're working on a sort of classical foundationalist, inductionist model. And if that's the case, then they're going to end up really back in the Big Bang, especially if they're atheistic, which then is again going to continue to violate the principle of sufficient reason and causality. So what are we left with? Well, we're left with God. And so then we'd really, although I went ahead and put Trinitarian God because this is Christian apologetics, you could just say God. You can make a more generalistic claim for theism, but maybe how we would differentiate from the Neoplatonists who are obsessed with the one, right? The one is that our God is personal. Our God has personhood and interacts with us personally. And our God is good. Our God is absolute. Our God is eternal. It's infinite. It's universal. And therefore, God. God can only be the answer for the absolute moral lawgiver. This is the argument for the existence of God, because what have we done? Well, we have argued that, well, let's move back here to our syllogism. Well, we've argued that morality is either absolute or relative. And we've proved that morality can't be relative because all these other things wouldn't cohere, would be incoherent, inconsistent. Nobody actually lives their life based on relative morality. And so morality is not relative. Point number 2. Therefore, morality is absolute. Okay, if morality is absolute, well then God must exist, because how can we root a absolute, objective, universal morality? If morality is objective and absolute, therefore God exists. And so that idea is all summed up in the concept of every law has a lawgiver. There is an absolute moral law. Therefore, there is an absolute moral lawgiver. And this concludes our video on the moral argument for the existence of God. So thank you guys for watching. I greatly appreciate that. This was just an introduction to this argument, so I was not going incredibly in depth. I was not trying to of which I hope to make many more on things like the contingency argument, the Kalam argument, the teleological argument, the intelligent design argument, various arguments regarding potency and act. But all those arguments are really going to be based on that classical foundationalist, that Aristotelian model of an induction to deduction. So anyways, you guys can expect videos in the future talking about those apologetic models. Again, I hope you better now understand the moral argument for the existence of God. I think this is a really strong argument for people who are seriously interested in finding God. However, they haven't really thought about these ideas, because this is where people live. You see, unlike the tag argument where you're spending half the time trying to get somebody to see the argument being made at a presuppositional level, that this one is right where people live. And if you make arguments about death and rape and pedophilia and incest, it's very easy for them to get conceptually to a place where, okay, well, there has to be an absolute moral law. Morality has to be objective. And once you're there, now you can make the logical follow that the only way to root something to be entirely absolute, objective, and universal is going to have to be rooted and justified in God. Now we have our sort of progress, our logical follow into the existence of God. That what we're doing, morality has to be absolute. If morality is absolute, therefore God has to exist, because that's the only place in which absolute morality can be justified. So thank you guys for all the love and support. Please like, share, and subscribe this video if you could. Really would appreciate if you guys know any friends who are interested in these ideas, that you share it with them or bring them over to the channel and bring them into our conversation. Make sure to leave a comment. Let me know what you guys think. Did you like this argument? It's a little bit different. I don't think it's as strong as the tag argument, as I mentioned, but I still think it's a good argument to have in your apologetic tool belt. Same with the Kalam and the contingency and the teleological and the intelligent design. Having the morality argument right there is a good one to know, especially the syllogisms, so you can go straight at the heart of a conversation or a debate with somebody. So thank you guys again. If you find this interesting, you might want to check out, if you haven't already, my previous video on the transcendental argument for God, which I believe is the strongest Christian apologetic method. So if you want to see what I think to be the strongest, check out my video on the transcendental argument of God, which will appear here at the end of this video. And so thank you guys again for all the love and support. I truly, truly appreciate it. And as always, until next time, God bless.